Picture the scene not as you might expect from a film, with a wild, disorganized mob heaving against a castle gate, but as something far more calculated. Imagine instead a vast, temporary city of tents and timberworks, silent in the pre-dawn darkness. Then, a single, clear bell rings out from a wooden tower erected by the attacking army. It is not a call to prayer, but a signal. Instantly, the camp erupts into a quiet, purposeful flurry of activity. Sentries change their posts in perfect unison. Cook fires are lit on schedule, engineers move to their siege engines, and thousands of soldiers fall into formation. This was the hidden reality of the medieval siege, an operation run with the precision of clockwork, where the most powerful weapon wasn't just the trebuchet or the battering ram, but the relentless, measurable tick of time itself. We often think of the Middle Ages as a period of chaos and brute force, but beneath the surface, a revolution was ticking. This is the story of how the invention of mechanical timekeeping transformed warfare, turning the art of the siege from a test of endurance into a science of coordination. It's a tale that connects the serene bells of a monastery to the thunder of cannon fire, revealing a level of sophistication that will change how you see this entire era. The ability to measure time accurately was a breakthrough that echoed from the quietest scriptorium to the loudest battlefield, and its impact was nothing short of military magic. Think about the sheer complexity of surrounding a fortress, of feeding an army of thousands, of building massive wooden towers and stone-throwing machines under the threat of arrow fire. Without a shared, reliable schedule, such an endeavor would descend into utter chaos. But with the emerging technology of the clock, commanders gained an unprecedented tool for control. They could now orchestrate movements across miles of terrain, ensuring that a diversionary attack at one section of the wall happened at the exact moment the real breach was being made elsewhere. They could manage the vital supply lines that kept their army fed and armed, and they could even use the predictable passage of time as a psychological weapon against those trapped inside the walls, their morale crumbling with each scheduled bell toll that marked another day of confinement. Why was synchronizing the firing of a cannon with the changing of a guard so revolutionary? Because it represented a fundamental shift in thinking. It meant understanding that victory wasn't just about having the strongest army, but about using time as a resource to be managed, optimized, and weaponized. This was the dawn of a new kind of military strategy, one built on logistics and synchronization, and its principles are still at the core of how modern armies operate today. In this video, we will journey back to uncover this hidden rhythm of medieval warfare. We will explore how the first weight-driven clocks gave commanders a new kind of power, how they built entire campaigns around timetables, and how the very concept of an hour changed the face of battle forever. We will see how time became a currency, a weapon, and a symbol of control. So, join us as we wind back the clock to an age where the strike of the hour could mean the difference between a kingdom won and an army lost, and discover the intricate clockwork that lay at the heart of siege warfare. But to truly grasp the revolutionary power of that bell ringing across a siege camp, we must first understand the world it was replacing. Before the mechanical clock, medieval society danced to the rhythm of nature, a rhythm that was profoundly uneven. The central unit of time was the temporal hour, a system where the period of daylight, no matter if it was 15 hours long in summer or only 9 in winter, was always divided into 12 equal parts. The same was done for the night. This meant an hour of daylight in June was significantly longer than an hour of daylight in December. Your day was stretched and compressed by the seasons. For telling these variable hours, people relied on sundials, useless on cloudy days or at night, or on elemental timekeepers like water clocks, which could freeze in winter, and hourglasses that required constant turning. Life was governed by these approximate, fluid measures: the position of the sun, the crowing of a rooster, the melting of a candle. This was a time sense suited to agriculture and prayer, but it was utterly inadequate for the complex, synchronized demands of a military campaign involving thousands of people. How could you order a coordinated attack for the 5th hour of the night when the length of that hour was constantly changing and no two water clocks might agree? The chaos of such a system is what makes the invention of the mechanical clock so extraordinary. Emerging in European monasteries and towns during the 14th century, this was a radical departure. These first weight-driven machines, often installed in church towers for all to see and hear, introduced the concept of the equal hour, the 60-minute unit we know today. For the first time, an hour was a fixed, unchanging measure, independent of the sun's journey across the sky. The historian David Lanz famously called the clock the key machine of the modern industrial age, and its genesis in the medieval period is crucial. Monasteries needed these devices to regulate the 7 canonical hours of prayer with unwavering discipline, day and night, summer and winter. This monastic obsession with orderly prayer created the technological and philosophical foundation for ordering all of society. The clock moved time from a natural, cyclical phenomenon to a mechanical, quantifiable resource that could be segmented, saved, and spent. This was a conceptual revolution as much as a technological one. It fostered a new mindset of precision, order, and synchronization that would ripple out from the monastery walls into the bustling town square, and finally, to the most demanding environment of all, the army camp. A commander now had a tool that could ensure every captain in his force understood 4 in the morning to mean the exact same moment. This shared, precise understanding of time was the invisible framework upon which the entire logistical and tactical marvel of a successful siege would be built. The clock was no longer just for marking prayers, it was a weapon of war waiting to be deployed. Now, let's step into that besieging army's camp at the first light of dawn. Before the sun has even crested the horizon, the air is pierced not by a rooster's crow, but by the deliberate, resonant strike of a bell from a central wooden tower. This sound is the heartbeat of the entire operation. Instantly, the sprawling temporary city of tents and timber stirs to life, but not with the chaotic clamor you might expect. Instead, it's a scene of remarkable order. Soldiers emerge from their tents to relieve the night watch at precise points along the perimeter. Cooks, having already been awake for an hour by the clock, begin distributing rations to units in a predetermined sequence. This is the logistical clockwork in action, the absolute bedrock of any successful siege. A medieval siege camp was a feat of organization, often housing thousands of soldiers, craftsmen, and camp followers, all of whom needed to be fed, managed, and put to work efficiently. Without a shared, reliable schedule, this miniature city would quickly descend into disorder, plagued by hunger, fatigue, and vulnerability. The introduction of standardized time was the key that unlocked a new level of military administration. It transformed a potentially unruly mob into a disciplined machine. The Roman military writer Vegetius, whose work De Re Militari was still widely read in the Middle Ages, had stressed centuries earlier that an army's strength lies not just in the courage of its soldiers, but in its discipline and routine. He wrote that an army is strengthened by labor and wasted by idleness. For the medieval commander, the mechanical clock provided the means to finally enforce this ideal on a grand scale. A shared timetable ensured that century rotations happened like clockwork, preventing fatigue and maintaining a constant, vigilant guard against sorties from the castle or attacks from a relief force. It allowed for the meticulous scheduling of work details, so that one team of laborers would arrive to dig siege trenches the moment the previous team, having worked a defined shift, departed for their meal. This constant rotation optimized effort and prevented burnout under the immense physical strain. Consider the blacksmiths whose forges were the engine room of the siege. Their work of sharpening tools, repairing armor, and forging arrowheads was scheduled in shifts to keep the fires burning and the hammers ringing 24 hours a day. Meanwhile, teams of engineers could coordinate their efforts on massive projects like building a trebuchet, with carpenters, rope makers, and sappers all working in a carefully orchestrated sequence, their progress measured against the relentless tick of the camp's central clock. A powerful example of this temporal discipline can be seen in the Siege of Harfleur in 1415, a key action in Henry V's campaign in France. Historical accounts emphasize the king's fanatical attention to camp organization. He enforced strict sanitation rules, controlled the distribution of food and clean water, and maintained a rigorous daily routine for his army. This discipline, underpinned by a shared understanding of the daily schedule, was what kept his forces healthy and effective during the grueling weeks of the siege, ultimately leading to the town's surrender. The army that could manage its time could manage its health, its supplies, and its morale. This logistical precision, born from the measured hour, was the essential foundation. It created the stable, well-supplied platform from which the far more complex and dangerous ballet of the actual assault could be launched. Now, with the camp running like a well-oiled machine, the commander's attention turns to the culmination of all this preparation, the moment of the assault. Picture the tense stillness that falls over the camp in the final hour before a planned attack. The usual sounds of industry have ceased. In the dim pre-dawn light, commanders and captains quietly consult their portable sundials or listen for the chime of the camp's central bell, their eyes fixed on the dark silhouette of the enemy walls. This was the most dangerous and complex phase of the entire siege, a carefully choreographed ballet of violence where a single misstep could lead to catastrophic failure. The principle was deceptively simple, yet devastatingly difficult to execute: the synchronized assault. Archers, infantrymen with scaling ladders, and specialized sappers armed with picks and axes all had to move as a single, cohesive unit. Without precise timing, an attack would degenerate into a series of disconnected, suicidal charges that the defenders could easily pick off one by one. Chronicles from the period are filled with accounts of attacks planned for specific, strategic hours. The preferred time was almost always the pre-dawn period, that dead of night just before first light when the human spirit is at its lowest ebb and the defenders on the walls would be at their weariest, their vigilance strained after a long night watch. This was not a random choice, it was a deliberate exploitation of human fatigue made possible by the attacker's ability to know with reasonable certainty exactly when that moment would arrive. This newfound mastery of the clock allowed for a level of tactical sophistication that was previously unimaginable. Commanders could design elaborate, multi-pronged attacks that required split-second timing across a broad front. Imagine the plan: a feinting attack on the main gate is launched at exactly 4 in the morning. The goal isn't to break through, but to make enough noise and show enough force to convince the defending captain that this is the primary threat. As the defenders rush to reinforce the gate, shouting alarms and drawing their best troops to that sector, the real danger is brewing silently elsewhere. At 4:30, precisely half an hour later, a second, true assault begins at a weakened section of the wall where sappers have been quietly working for days. The coordination required was breathtaking. archers had to provide covering fire in disciplined volleys, raining arrows down on the battlements to force the defenders to keep their heads down just as the infantry began their advance with siege ladders. This covering fire couldn't start too early, or it would waste precious arrows and alert the enemy to the true point of attack. It couldn't start too late, or the men on the ladders would be exposed. Every element, from the first arrow volley to the moment the first soldier crested the wall, was tied to a shared timetable. A classic example of this strategic coordination on a grand scale is the Siege of Constantinople in 1453. While the Ottomans didn't have wristwatches, the accounts suggest that Sultan Mehmed II orchestrated a relentless campaign designed to stretch the Byzantine defenders to the breaking point. He would allegedly coordinate naval bombardments from the Horn with massive infantry assaults on the land walls, forcing the outnumbered defenders to rush from one crisis point to another, never able to rest or concentrate their forces. This strategy of simultaneous pressure, even with the approximate time signals of cannon fire and massed drumming, relied on a fundamental understanding of timed, coordinated action. It turned the Ottoman army from a mere mass of soldiers into a surgical instrument, applying precise pressure at multiple points to exploit every weakness. This intricate dance of archers, infantry, and engineers, all moving to the same relentless rhythm, was what could crack the toughest nut. But as siegecraft evolved, a new, thunderous instrument joined this orchestra, one that would make the control of time more critical than ever: the devastating power of gunpowder artillery. Now introduce a new sound to the cacophony of the siege, the deafening, earth-shaking roar of a cannon. But in its earliest days, this was a sound of chaos. The thunder of early gunpowder artillery was immense, but it was also irregular, unpredictable. A single massive bombard might fire, then fall silent for an hour or more as its crew struggled with the long, dangerous process of reloading. This presented a new and critical problem for commanders. How could they turn this powerful but sporadic weapon into a reliable tool for breaking down walls and breaking enemy spirits? The solution, once again, was found in the disciplined application of time. The introduction of artillery didn't make timekeeping less important. It made it absolutely essential. The reloading and firing cycle of a cannon became a matter of calculated efficiency, a mechanical rhythm that had to be mastered. Commanders began to devise something we might call an artillery timetable. Instead of having all their guns fire at once in a single, spectacular but fleeting volley, they would organize their batteries to fire in sequenced rotations. While one battery was firing, the one next to it would be in the middle of its reloading procedure, and a third would be just beginning the process. This created a rolling barrage, a near-constant hammering on a specific section of the enemy wall that gave defenders no respite. The relentless, rhythmic pounding was far more effective at crumbling masonry than occasional, massive blasts. We can see early attempts to systematize this kind of warfare in the notebooks of Renaissance engineers like Mariano Toccola and Giovanni Fontana. Their meticulously detailed drawings show not only the machines of war, but also imply the careful procedures needed to operate them effectively. They understood that the machine was only as good as the crew that served it, and that crew's effectiveness hinged on a shared, disciplined understanding of time. The safety of the gun crew itself depended on this temporal discipline. Firing a cannon generated tremendous heat. If a crew tried to reload too quickly while the barrel was still scorching hot, the new gunpowder charge could ignite prematurely, causing a catastrophic explosion that would kill the entire team. A strict timetable enforced necessary cooling periods. It also mandated a thorough cleaning of the barrel between shots with a wet sponge on a long staff, called a worm, to extinguish any lingering embers from the previous charge. This wasn't just about safety, it was about maintaining a high, sustainable rate of fire. A disciplined crew working to a set rhythm could fire more accurately and more often than a rushed, panicked one. This timed artillery fire also became the key to protecting other elements of the assault. Imagine a massive siege tower, a wooden giant on wheels, being slowly pushed toward the castle walls. It was a vulnerable target, a magnet for enemy arrows, stones, and incendiaries. To protect it, commanders would order a timed suppressing barrage. As the tower began its advance, the artillery would intensify its fire on the battlements directly in its path, forcing the defenders to take cover. This covering fire had to be precisely coordinated. It needed to begin just as the tower started moving and had to be sustained until the moment it reached the wall. If the fire ceased too early, the defenders would swarm back to their positions. If it continued too late, it risked hitting the tower itself or the friendly troops swarming out of it. A powerful illustration of this evolving artillery duel can be found in the Siege of Orleans in 1429. The conflict between the French, inspired by Joan of Arc, and the English besiegers became a dramatic back and forth of cannonades. Both sides relied heavily on their guns, not just for breaking walls but for counter-battery fire, trying to knock out the enemy's own artillery. The success of these operations depended entirely on which side could maintain a more consistent, better supplied, and better timed rate of fire. The side that mastered the rhythm held a decisive advantage. This created a remarkable symbiosis on the battlefield. The external, thunderous rhythm of the artillery barrage, fire, cool, clean, reload, mirrored the internal, ticking mechanics of the clocks that made its coordination possible. It was a perfect fusion of new violence and new order, a partnership between the destructive power of gunpowder and the organizing power of the clock. But this relentless, predictable pounding did more than just break stone. It began to break minds, introducing a psychological dimension to warfare that was every bit as calculated as the physical assault. Now shift your perspective from the orderly chaos of the attacking camp to the strained silence within the besieged castle walls. Inside, the mood is entirely different. For the defenders and civilians trapped within, the most unnerving sound is not the occasional blast of a cannon, but the clear, unwavering toll of the enemy's bell marking the passage of each hour, each day, each week. This regular chime, a symbol of the attacker's discipline and control, becomes a psychological instrument of immense power. The siege was always a battle of wills, a test of endurance where morale could crumble long before the walls did. And in this mental contest, the controlled measurement of time became a devastating weapon of terror. The besiegers learned to wield time in two contrasting yet equally effective ways, through the agony of predictability and the torment of unpredictability. On one hand, a commander might formally announce that a final, full-scale assault would commence at dawn on a specific date. This transformed the preceding days into a torturous countdown. Every meal, every conversation, every attempt to sleep would be shadowed by the looming, inescapable deadline. Defenders' diaries from various sieges often describe this peculiar form of suffering, the knowledge of exactly when the storm would break, making the waiting itself a kind of hell. The mind would race, imagining the coming horrors, and the constant, rhythmic marking of the hours by the enemy's clock only amplified the anxiety, making the passage of time feel like a drumbeat marching toward doom. Conversely, a clever besieger might employ the opposite tactic. Instead of a declared assault, they might launch a series of sudden, sharp attacks at completely random intervals in the dead of night, at high noon, or during a rainstorm. This strategy aimed to shatter any sense of routine or safety for the defenders. It denied them the ability to rest properly, keeping them in a perpetual state of high alert. The constant fear of an attack that could come at any moment was exhausting, fraying nerves and leading to mistakes born of fatigue. This deliberate unpredictability meant that the enemy's bell no longer signaled a predictable event, but instead served as a constant reminder that a crisis could arrive with the next chime. The psychological warfare could take on an even more direct and symbolic form. There are accounts of besiegers confident in their impending victory, presenting a beautifully crafted hourglass or clock to the defenders as part of a surrender ultimatum. This was far more than a simple message. It was a profound psychological blow. The gift of a timepiece made the abstract threat of time incredibly tangible. It placed a physical representation of their dwindling chances right in front of them, a constant visual countdown to their potential destruction if they did not yield. It communicated that the besieger was not just a brute force, but a calculating, patient enemy who had mastered time itself and was now using it against them. We can see an early, powerful example of this relentless temporal pressure in the Siege of Jerusalem during the First Crusade in 1099. While the Crusaders lacked precise mechanical clocks, their tactics were a masterclass in applying relentless, timed pressure. Historical accounts describe how they launched coordinated assaults on the city's walls day after day, with a grim regularity that wore down the Fatimid defenders. There was no prolonged respite, no extended period for recovery. Each sunrise brought the expectation of another furious attack. This unyielding rhythm, this daily demonstration of the attacker's resolve and organization, systematically broke the defender's spirit. The physical damage was significant, but it was the psychological exhaustion, the erosion of hope that came with each new day of fighting, that ultimately contributed to the city's fall. This demonstrates with chilling clarity that the clock's influence extended far beyond the physical coordination of troops. Its true power lay in its ability to get inside the minds of the enemy, to turn the most fundamental aspect of existence, the passage of time, into an agent of fear and despair. This mental pressure was as strategic and calculated as any cannonball or siege tower, proving that the most sophisticated warfare targets the spirit as well as the body. To truly grasp the power of the siege clock, we need to witness it in action on one of history's grandest stages, the final, dramatic Siege of Constantinople in 1453. This wasn't just a battle between two armies, it was a profound clash between two civilizations with vastly different relationships to time and technology. On one side stood the Byzantine Empire, the ancient heir to Rome, a realm steeped in tradition and reliant on the old rhythms of sundials, hourglasses, and the liturgical calendar. On the other was the ascendant Ottoman Empire, led by the young and ferociously ambitious Sultan Mehmed II, a force that seemed to embody a new, more systematic and relentless approach to warfare. The scene was set for a confrontation that would hinge not just on courage or numbers, but on the ability to orchestrate a mammoth military operation with unwavering persistence. The key to understanding Mehmed's success lies in examining his command of temporal logistics, his ability to make time work for him on an unprecedented scale. As the historian Roger Crowley vividly describes in his accounts, the Ottoman siege was characterized by its relentless, round-the-clock nature. This wasn't an army that rested, it was a machine that operated on a continuous cycle, and that kind of sustained pressure requires a sophisticated understanding of scheduling and coordination. The most obvious manifestation of this was the Sultan's secret weapon, his massive bronze bombards, particularly the legendary giant cannon built by the Hungarian engineer Orban. This monstrosity was so enormous it had a reload time of several hours. A weapon like that, if fired haphazardly, would be little more than a spectacular novelty. But the Ottomans turned it into a strategic tool. They didn't just fire it at random, they developed a firing schedule. While one cannon was cooling and being cleaned after a shot, another would be prepared to fire, creating a staggered, near-constant bombardment that pounded the mighty Theodosian walls day and night. This systematic barrage prevented the Byzantine defenders from making effective repairs and subjected them to unending psychological strain, the thunderous blows landing with a terrible regularity that must have felt like the heartbeat of doom itself. But the coordination required went far beyond the artillery park. One of Mehmed's most audacious tactics was the movement of his fleet. The Byzantine capital was protected on one side by a great chain stretched across the Golden Horn, blocking the Ottoman navy from entering the vital inlet. Mehmed's solution was as brilliant as it was labor-intensive. He would bypass the chain entirely by dragging his ships overland. This meant transporting dozens of galleys on greased wooden rails from the Bosphorus Strait over a hill and into the Golden Horn behind the chain. This incredible feat was less a single event and more a massive, timed logistical project. It required the precise coordination of thousands of laborers working in shifts around the clock. Teams of oxen and men had to be cycled in and out to maintain constant momentum, with engineers overseeing the process to ensure the ships were moved, launched, and made ready for battle in a coordinated sequence. This wasn't just brute force, it was a meticulously managed operation where the synchronization of human effort was everything. The Byzantines, for all their courage, were ill-equipped to counter this new form of warfare. Their defensive plans were based on anticipating attacks, on reading the intentions of an enemy who operated on a more familiar, human scale. They were unprepared for an adversary who attacked at all hours, who maintained constant pressure, and who executed complex, multi-phase operations that required seamless timing across land and sea. The failure to predict and disrupt these Ottoman rhythms highlights a critical technological and organizational gap. The Byzantine Empire, for centuries the guardian of classical knowledge, was now being outmaneuvered by an empire that had mastered the practical application of time as a weapon. The fall of Constantinople stands as a stark lesson. Mastery over time was rapidly becoming a decisive factor in warfare. The side that could best schedule, synchronize, and sustain its efforts held an advantage that could overcome even the strongest walls. This pivotal moment demonstrated that the future of conflict belonged not just to the strongest, but to the most precisely organized. Yet for all the strategic brilliance this new timekeeping enabled, we must temper our admiration with a dose of reality. The precision of a medieval siege was a monumental achievement precisely because it was accomplished with tools that were, by modern standards, infuriatingly fragile and unreliable. Picture the scene, a carefully planned night attack set for 2 hours after midnight. The commander's plan hinges on absolute darkness and the element of surprise. But the water clock, or clepsydra, responsible for awakening the assault force, sits in an open tent. A sudden, unseasonable frost descends, and the water inside freezes solid, stopping the flow that measures the hours. The crucial signal is never given. The attacking unit sleeps on, while the diversionary force charges forward alone into a prepared slaughter. Alternatively, imagine relying on a marked candle to time the changing of the guard. A gust of wind through the camp flaps the tent canvas, making the candle flame gutter and burn erratically faster. The guard change happens too early, leaving a section of the perimeter exposed at the most vulnerable hour. These were not rare catastrophes but constant, nagging possibilities. The very devices that brought order were themselves susceptible to the chaotic whims of nature and simple human fallibility. The sundial, the most ancient of timekeepers, was useless on the cloudy, rainy days that were a staple of any prolonged campaign in Europe. The astrolabe, a sophisticated instrument for astronomers, could chart the stars to determine the hour at night. but it required a clear sky and a skilled operator, neither of which could be guaranteed in the mud and tension of a siege camp. Even the celebrated mechanical clocks, the marvels of their age, were far from perfect. Their iron gears were crude, their weight-driven mechanisms prone to friction and wear. Changes in temperature could cause metal components to expand or contract, subtly altering their speed. A sudden downpour could rust a crucial spring, while a period of intense humidity might slow the entire mechanism down. Military manuals of the period are filled with cautious advice that reveals this underlying anxiety. Commanders were warned to compare the time on multiple devices and to appoint reliable men to constantly monitor and maintain them. The equal hour that promised such uniformity was in practice still a relative concept. A clock in the main command tent might be meticulously reset to solar noon each day, using a sundial when the sun was visible. But a similar clock on the far side of the massive encampment might be reset by a different night a few minutes later, or not at all for a day or two. Over the course of a week, these tiny discrepancies could accumulate into a difference of half an hour or more. This created a dangerous potential for confusion when coordinating movements across a wide area. A captain on the eastern flank, acting on the time from his local clock, might begin his advance while the captain on the western flank, whose clock was running slow, was still briefing his troops. The result would be a staggered, ineffective attack that played directly into the defender's hands. The human element was the greatest variable of all. The monk or knight tasked with ringing the bell or turning the hourglass was subject to fatigue, distraction, or simple error. He might doze off during the long night watch or misjudge the sand level in a dimly lit tent. There were no automatic alarms. The entire system relied on the unwavering vigilance of a single individual. This inherent, unavoidable imprecision forces us to reconsider what military precision meant in the Middle Ages. It was not the digital, nanosecond accuracy we think of today. Instead, it was a remarkable exercise in managed uncertainty. Commanders had to build flexibility and redundancy into their seemingly rigid timetables. Plans likely included contingency signals, like a series of trumpet blasts to launch an attack immediately if the clock-based timing failed. Orders probably specified a window of time rather than a single-minute attack in the first hour after dawn to account for small variations across the camp. The success of a medieval siege, therefore, was not just a triumph of technology, but a triumph of organization and adaptability over the limitations of imperfect tools. It was the human ability to impose order on a system that was always threatening to drift into chaos, a testament to the skill of commanders who could achieve breathtaking coordination, not despite the flaws of their clocks, but by understanding and planning for them. Within the stout walls of a Crusader castle, the sound that governed life was not the clash of steel, but the resonant, predictable toll of a bell. This single sound marked the hours for both prayer and patrol, a perfect symbol of one of the most powerful fusions in medieval history, the marriage of monastic discipline and military might. The very technology that ordered the spiritual world, the measured hour, was about to be harnessed to bring a new kind of order to the battlefield. This transfer happened most directly through the unique institution of the military religious orders, organizations like the Knights Templar, the Hospitallers, and the Teutonic Knights. These men were not just warriors, they were also monks, bound by strict religious rules that regimented their entire existence. Their daily lives were a blend of the chapel and the barracks, and the key to managing this dual identity was the relentless, precise scheduling of the day. The monastic day was divided into the 7 canonical hours of the divine office, a cycle of prayers that began before dawn with matins and lauds and continued at set intervals throughout the day and night, culminating with compline in the evening. This rigid timetable required a reliable way to mark the hours, which is why monasteries were among the earliest and most enthusiastic adopters of mechanical clocks. The discipline of the clock was for them a pathway to spiritual devotion and communal harmony. The rules of these orders, such as the rule of the Templars, read almost like military manuals crossed with monastic charters. They prescribed in exacting detail when the brothers were to rise, pray, eat, train, and sleep. Silence was enforced at certain hours, and specific prayers were recited at others. This created a lifestyle of profound routine and obedience, where individual will was sublimated to the rhythm of the community. When this same disciplined mind was applied to warfare, the results were transformative. A Templar knight on campaign did not see the schedule as a constraint, but as the divine structure of his day. The same bell that called him to prayer also called him to stand watch or to form up for a march. This ingrained habit of responding instantly to a timed signal made these orders exceptionally responsive and coordinated on the battlefield. They were, in essence, the first professional, standing army of the Middle Ages, and their professionalism was rooted in this temporal discipline. The Teutonic Order in the Baltic region provides a spectacular example of this fusion in action. Their fortifications in Prussia were not merely castles, they were Ordensburgen, combination monasteries, and military bases. These sprawling complexes housed knights, priests, and sergeants, all living under the same rule. The entire community moved to the sound of the bell, which governed a daily round that seamlessly integrated spiritual obligations with military readiness. The complex bell-ringing sequences developed in monasteries found a new, urgent purpose here. The pattern of the bells might signal the call to the midday prayer of sext, but a different, more frantic peal would signal an alarm, a call to arms because the fortress was under attack. The inhabitants were conditioned to understand these auditory codes instantly, moving from contemplative silence to organized, defensive violence in a matter of moments. This system meant that a Teutonic fortress could mobilize its entire garrison with an efficiency that would be the envy of any secular lord. There was no confusion, no delay. Every man knew his station and his duty based on the signal he heard. This fusion of the sacred and the martial created a template for military organization that would eventually be adopted by the rising secular monarchies of Europe. Commanders observing the success of the military orders saw the undeniable advantage of having an army that operated with the synchronized precision of a monastery. The principles of strict scheduling, clear auditory signals, and a shared daily routine became the foundation for organizing larger national armies. The pursuit of spiritual order, it turned out, had accidentally engineered the perfect model for martial order, proving that the path to military efficiency was first paved by the disciplined heartbeat of the monastic clock. While a commander on land could impose his own mechanical schedule on a siege camp, a leader conducting a naval blockade faced a far more ancient and inflexible master, the moon itself. The success or failure of a siege against a coastal fortress could hinge on the simple yet profound challenge of the tides. Imagine the captain of a royal galley, part of a fleet blockading a vital port. His orders are clear: maintain a tight cordon, preventing any supplies or reinforcements from reaching the enemy. But as the day wears on, he watches the water level around his ship begin to drop with an alarming speed. The deep channel that allowed him to threaten the harbor entrance just hours ago is now transforming into a treacherous expanse of mudflats, leaving his vessel stranded and impotent. His mighty warship, a symbol of royal power, is suddenly as helpless as a beached whale, forced to watch as smaller, shallow-draft enemy boats might slip past just out of range. This was the relentless reality of amphibious warfare. A commander who understood the rhythms of his mechanical clocks but ignored the celestial clock of the tides was doomed to fail. The true masters of medieval siegecraft were those who learned to synchronize their man-made schedules with the immutable gravitational pull of the moon, weaving together astronomical and mechanical time into a single, coherent strategy. For this, they turned to the specialized knowledge of sailors and navigators, whose very lives depended on reading the sea. Medieval mariners used detailed portolan charts, which mapped coastlines with remarkable accuracy, and they supplemented these with tidal almanacs. These were practical documents, often passed down as closely guarded secrets, that recorded the timing and height of tides for specific locations. They understood that high tide, or the flood, occurred roughly every 12 hours and 25 minutes, but that the exact timing and strength varied dramatically from place to place, influenced by the shape of the coastline and the seafloor. A wise military commander would consult these experts before planning any operation against a coastal target. The tactical applications of this knowledge were numerous and decisive. Scheduling an amphibious assault to coincide with a high tide was paramount. It allowed larger warships and troop transports to sail much closer to the enemy's walls, minimizing the distance soldiers had to wade through water under a hail of arrows and stones. It could also enable ships to cross defensive barriers like submerged logs or stakes that were designed to rip open hulls at low water. Conversely, a low tide could present its own unique opportunities. As the water receded, it might expose the vulnerable foundations of a seawall, allowing sappers or engineers to assess damage or even attempt to undermine them directly. In some cases, a dramatically low tide could reveal a previously hidden sandbar or create a temporary land bridge to an island fortress, opening an unexpected avenue of attack for infantry. The logistical implications were just as critical. A fleet blockading a port had to be supplied, and timing the arrival of these vital supply ships was an art in itself. A captain arriving with a hold full of food and arrows at low tide might find the harbor entrance too shallow to enter, leaving him exposed to enemy raids from the shore for hours until the water rose again. A well-timed arrival on a high tide, however, meant a swift and safe passage into the relative safety of the anchored fleet. A prime example of this mastery of the lunar clock can be seen in the Siege of Calais, which began in 1346. King Edward III of England, determined to capture this strategic French port, knew that a successful land assault was not enough. He had to completely strangle the city by sea. His navy's mission was to maintain an unbreakable blockade. To do this effectively, his admirals needed an intimate understanding of the tidal patterns in the English Channel. They had to know when high tide would allow their ships to patrol aggressively close to the harbor mouth, presenting a formidable threat, and when the ebb tide would force them to withdraw to deeper waters to avoid grounding. This rhythmic dance with the tides ensured that the blockade remained effective around the clock, preventing any French relief fleet from exploiting a moment of vulnerability. Edward's success in besieging and eventually starving Calais into submission was a testament not just to his army's discipline, but to his navy's ability to operate in harmony with the natural world. It demonstrated that the most effective medieval commanders were not just technicians of war, they were naturalists and astronomers of a sort, forced to commandeer the very cycles of the planet to serve their ambitions. They had to be masters of two timekeeping worlds, blending the predictable tick of the clock with the slow, powerful breath of the ocean. Now, let's pull back from the thunder of the battlefield and step into the quiet, anxious atmosphere of a royal command tent, where a different kind of war was being waged. Here, a king or his treasurer wouldn't be studying maps of enemy walls, but rather spreadsheets of expenses, each line item ticking upward with the relentless passage of every hour. A prolonged siege was arguably the most financially draining undertaking a medieval monarch could attempt, a massive, slow-burning fire fueled by gold and silver. And in this high-stakes economic battle, the ability to accurately measure time became as valuable as any sword. It transformed time from an abstract concept into a tangible, quantifiable resource, a currency that was being spent with every sunrise. The entire endeavor operated on a brutal logic. The longer a siege dragged on, the more it cost. A commander wasn't just fighting an enemy army, he was racing against the emptying of his own treasury. This is where the economic clock began to tick, governing everything from payroll to procurement. Royal account books from the period are filled with incredibly detailed entries that reveal this temporal mindset. Payments to master engineers, for instance, were often calculated by the day or the week, creating a powerful financial incentive for speed and efficiency. A master carpenter building a trebuchet wasn't just paid a flat fee, he was paid for the time he and his crew spent on the project. This system encouraged a relentless pace, as the king's money was directly financing the race against the calendar. The same principle applied to the vast majority of the army, the common soldiers, and especially the crucial mercenaries who formed the backbone of many medieval forces. These professional fighters were typically hired on contracts that specified their rate of pay for a set period, a month, a season, or for the duration of a specific campaign. Their service was quite literally bought by the unit of time. Every day the siege continued was another day of wages that had to be found, often in hard coin that was difficult to transport and in limited supply. A commander who lost track of time wasn't just risking a tactical blunder, he was flirting with bankruptcy, which could lead to his army simply dissolving as unpaid soldiers deserted. But the economic application of timekeeping went far beyond simple payroll. Accurate time measurement allowed for sophisticated forecasting that was vital for survival. An army of 10,000 men and their horses consumed a staggering amount of food, water, and fodder each day. A quartermaster needed to know with reasonable accuracy how long their current supplies would last. By knowing the date and the rate of consumption, he could calculate the precise day when the army would face starvation if a new supply convoy did not arrive. This allowed for proactive rather than reactive logistics. Instead of waiting for a crisis, the commander could dispatch orders weeks in advance to gather supplies from surrounding regions and schedule their delivery to coincide with the depletion of existing stocks. This just-in-time approach, primitive by today's standards but revolutionary for its era, minimized waste and reduced the immense cost of stockpiling vast quantities of food that might spoil or be plundered. It also lessened the burden on the local countryside, which was often stripped bare to feed a stationary army, a practice that could spark rebellion and cut off future sources of supply. A brilliant case study of this financial and temporal mastery is the Siege of Choreographing between 1203 and 1204. The formidable fortress, built by Richard the Lionheart, was considered nearly impregnable. King Philip II of France knew that a direct assault would be bloody and likely futile. Instead, he embarked on what can only be described as a methodical, patient investment. He surrounded the castle, cutting it off from relief, and then settled in for a long, expensive siege. His strategy was a masterclass in economic warfare. Philip's administration meticulously managed the resources required to sustain his blockading force through an entire winter. They calculated supply routes, managed payroll for a multinational force, and systematically constructed their own siege works, all according to a protracted but carefully managed timetable. The fall of Choreographing was not just a military triumph, it was a financial one. Philip had successfully outlasted the defenders not merely through force of arms, but through superior economic endurance. He had proven that he could manage the astronomical cost of a timed war better than his enemies could withstand it. This immense economic pressure fundamentally changed the calculus of warfare. It meant that a clever defender might try to prolong a siege intentionally, not to win, but to bankrupt the attacker, making victory too costly to be worthwhile. For the attacker, it meant that speed and efficiency were not just tactical advantages, but financial imperatives. The clock on the bell tower was, in essence, also a meter on the royal treasury, and the monarch who could read both held the true key to victory. Amidst the shouts of commanders and the clash of steel, the true conductor of a medieval siege was not a person, but a carefully orchestrated symphony of sound. Before the era of wristwatches and radio signals, the sprawling chaos of a besieging army and the tense silence of a defended city were governed by an intricate language of acoustic commands. This was a world where time was not seen on a dial, but heard in the air, a system of audible timekeeping that turned noise into order and coordinated thousands of people across vast distances. Primary instruments in this orchestra were the trumpet, the drum, and the bell, each with a distinct and vital role. Military ordinances from the period are remarkably specific, reading almost like a musical score for war. They detailed the exact trumpet calls for every conceivable action, a specific series of notes for reveille to wake the camp at a precise hour, a different fanfare to signal the assembly of troops for inspection, and an urgent, repeating call to announce an immediate attack. There was even a designated call for retreat, a sound that had to cut through the din of battle to save an army from destruction. This codification was essential. It meant that a knight from England and a mercenary from Gascony, fighting side by side, would both understand the exact same command from the commanding captain's trumpeter. The sound itself became a shared, precise language that transcended spoken words. Alongside the trumpet, the deep, resonant beat of the drum served as the army's audible metronome, setting the rhythm for all movement. For a relief column marching across country to break a siege, the drum provided a steady, relentless pace that ensured the force arrived together and with enough energy left to fight. Within the siege camp itself, the drum's rhythm organized the labor of hundreds of men digging trenches or moving heavy siege engines. A steady, moderate beat might dictate the pace for shifting earth, while a faster, more intense rhythm could signal a final, desperate push to complete a rampart before an expected counterattack. This constant, percussive backdrop turned disjointed individual effort into a synchronized, massively efficient machine. For those trapped inside the besieged city or castle, the most important sound was the ringing of their own church bells. These bells regulated the defenders' lives, marking curfews, signaling meal times, and most importantly, sounding the alarm. A specific, frantic pealing would send every able-bodied person rushing to the walls, a system that allowed a small garrison to mobilize its entire population for defense in moments. Understanding this, a key objective for besiegers was often to disrupt or silence this auditory clock. Archers would be ordered to target bell towers, and successful attackers would frequently seize control of the bells first, silencing the defenders' command system and ringing their own victory peal, a powerful psychological symbol of their new control over the city's time and space. Beyond these immediate sounds, simpler but equally clever methods were used for long-distance, timed communication. The use of beacon fires on high hills is a classic example. While not precise to the minute, these fires could communicate a pre-arranged, time-sensitive message across a kingdom. A single fire lit at a coastal fort upon sighting an enemy fleet might mean the invasion has begun. and the chain of fires lit in response would carry that message to the capital faster than any rider could travel. It was a way to synchronize the response of an entire nation to a single event, a grand-scale application of timed signaling. This entire system of acoustic commands, from the captain's trumpet to the watchman's bell, was the crucial, practical interface. It was the tangible link that translated the abstract measurement of the clock tower into the physical reality of soldiers advancing, laborers digging, and defenders rallying. It connected the cerebral planning of the commander's tent to the gritty execution on the ground, proving that in the age before digital precision, the most powerful tool for synchronizing an army was a well-trained ear. Picture the military engineer not as a solitary figure sketching machines, but as the conductor of an entire symphony of destruction. His plans a complex score where every note is timed to perfection. He unrolls a parchment, and alongside the intricate diagrams of trebuchets and siege towers, you would find annotations that reveal the true nature of his work, notes on construction phases, labor shifts, and assault schedules. This individual was far more than a designer of weapons. He was a master temporal planner, a pioneer of project management whose success hinged on one critical skill: the ability to accurately estimate the time required for every single task, from felling the first tree to storming the final breach. His blueprint was, in essence, a timeline written in wood and stone. We gain a fascinating glimpse into this multidisciplinary mind from the notebooks of figures like Villard de Honnecourt, a 13th-century master mason whose sketchbook is a breathtaking fusion of sacred architecture, mechanical wonders, and even early clockwork devices. His pages show a mind that saw the world in terms of interconnected systems and precise movements, a way of thinking directly applicable to the orchestrated chaos of a siege. For the military engineer, every project began with a daunting calculation of man-hours. To build a siege tower capable of surviving a hail of arrows and fire, he needed to first calculate how many trees, how much rope, and how many nails were required. But more importantly, he had to estimate how long it would take his teams of carpenters, blacksmiths, and laborers to transform that raw material into a functioning weapon. A miscalculation could be disastrous. If the tower was completed too early, it might sit exposed to the elements or enemy sabotage. If it was finished too late, it could miss its crucial window in the assault schedule, throwing the entire operation into disarray. This temporal planning extended to the most dangerous work of all: sapping, the process of digging tunnels under fortress walls to collapse them. This was a race against time and detection. The engineer had to estimate the digging rate of his sappers based on the soil type, the depth required, and the constant threat of counter-mining by the defenders. He had to synchronize this invisible, subterranean progress with the activities on the surface. The feinting attack by infantry at the main gate had to be launched at the exact moment the sappers below were placing the wooden supports in their tunnel, ready to set them ablaze. The roar of the collapsing wall needed to be the signal for the main assault force to surge forward. This required the seamless coordination of completely different specialist teams: carpenters building protective sheds for the sap heads, sappers digging in the dark, and soldiers providing covering fire, all moving to a shared, invisible timetable. A historical figure who embodies this role of the engineer as a practical manager of time and men was John Crabbe, a famed Flemish mercenary and military engineer of the early 14th century. Known for his expertise in maritime raids and siegecraft, Crabbe was a valuable asset precisely because he could deliver results. His reputation was built on his ability to execute complex operations, which would have been impossible without a rigorous approach to scheduling and logistics. Whether it was calculating the tide schedules for a coastal attack or estimating the time needed to construct battering rams for a land siege, Men like Crabbe were the crucial link between the grand strategy of the commander and the gritty reality of the work camp. They were the original project managers, translating a strategic goal into a step-by-step process governed by the relentless tick of the clock, understanding that the most brilliant machine was useless if it wasn't ready at the precise moment it was needed. While the besieging army relied on the predictable rhythm of its camp clock, a clever defender understood that survival depended on shattering that very rhythm. Imagine the dead of night, a few hours after the attackers have finally settled into an exhausted sleep. Suddenly, a hidden postern gate in the castle wall creaks open, and a small band of defenders slips out. Their objective is not a glorious battle, it is far more subtle and insidious. They creep towards the enemy lines not to engage the main force, but to target the sentries and create a sudden, localized uproar. After a few minutes of shouted alarms and clashing steel, they melt back into the darkness, leaving the entire besieging camp jolted awake and gripped by confusion. The goal of this raid was not to win a military victory, but to wage psychological and temporal warfare to ruin the enemy's sleep and, crucially, to disrupt their meticulously planned schedule for the following day. This was the essence of counter-time tactics, a form of asymmetric warfare where the defender's best weapon was unpredictable chaos aimed squarely at the attacker's greatest asset, their orderly use of time. Defensive manuals from the period are filled with this kind of shrewd advice. They encouraged commanders to launch frequent sorties, to stage false alarms in the middle of the night, and to constantly harass the enemy's work details. One of the most brilliant and perhaps most daring strategies was to directly attack the enemy's timekeeping devices themselves. A successful raid that managed to sabotage the central clock tower or silence the commanding officer's prized hourglass could throw the entire siege operation into disarray, creating a ripple effect of mistimed rotations and miscoordinated attacks. The defenders worked tirelessly to impose their own erratic timetable on the attackers. If the besiegers were a clockwork mechanism, the defenders' role was to throw sand in the gears. By forcing the enemy to be constantly on guard, they aimed to waste their energy and morale. A force that is repeatedly roused from sleep by false alarms becomes fatigued, irritable, and prone to mistakes. Soldiers denied rest cannot dig trenches efficiently or fight effectively. Engineers operating on broken sleep are more likely to make fatal errors in their calculations. The defender's unpredictability forced the attacker to divert vast resources from offense to constant defense, stretching their manpower thin and grinding down their campaign's momentum. Another clever tactic involved the deliberate destruction of local landmarks. A besieging army, especially one in unfamiliar territory, often used natural features or prominent buildings as visual cues for telling time or coordinating movements. A distinctive tree used as a marker for a meeting point, or a distant church spire whose shadow indicated the noon hour. By burning that tree or demolishing that spire, the defenders could create a profound sense of disorientation within the enemy ranks, severing their connection to the familiar rhythms of the landscape. A powerful illustration of these principles in action can be found in the defense of Stirling Castle during the Wars of Scottish Independence. When English forces laid siege to this key strategic fortress, the Scottish defenders, intimately familiar with the rugged terrain, refused to play by the rules of a conventional siege. Instead of waiting passively behind their walls, they used the surrounding hills and forests to their advantage. They launched relentless guerrilla attacks on English supply lines, ambushed patrols, and made sudden, sharp strikes against siege works under construction. This constant, unpredictable harassment meant the English could never establish a secure, routine operation. Their carefully drafted timetables for building battering rams or digging siege trenches became worthless documents. as every work detail required a massive protective escort and was perpetually vulnerable to disruption. The Scottish tactics effectively broke the English siege clock, turning a straightforward military operation into an exhausting, demoralizing quagmire. This constant, hidden battle for the control of time transformed a siege from a simple contest of strength into a sophisticated duel of wits. It was a game of mental chess where the defender's most powerful moves were designed not to kill soldiers, but to kill time itself, wasting the most precious and irreplaceable resource the attacker possessed. The relentless, calculated tick of the siege clock did not fade away with the last stone castle. Its echo grew louder, resonating through the centuries to become the very heartbeat of modern warfare. Consider for a moment the sheer scale of the D-Day landings on June 6, 1944. It was an undertaking of almost unimaginable complexity, involving thousands of ships, aircraft, and vehicles delivering hundreds of thousands of troops across the English Channel to multiple beaches in Normandy. The entire operation was a symphony of precision timed to the minute. Paratroopers had to be dropped behind enemy lines in the dead of night to secure key positions before the naval bombardment began at a specific hour. Landing craft had to hit the beaches in successive waves, their arrivals coordinated with the shifting tides to avoid obstacles and ensure supporting tanks could be unloaded. This was not merely a larger version of a medieval assault. It was the ultimate expression of a principle forged in the siege camps of the Middle Ages. That victory belongs to the commander who can synchronize the actions of disparate forces across a vast battlefield. The medieval general who coordinated a feint at the gate with a mine under the wall was practicing the same essential art as the Allied planners of Operation Overlord. The tools had evolved from bell towers to radios, but the fundamental strategic insight that time is a weapon to be sharpened and wielded with exacting care remained unchanged. This conceptual shift, which elevated time to a central resource in military planning, is the most profound legacy of the siege clock. The great Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz famously wrote of the fog of war, the chaos and uncertainty that descends upon the battlefield, obscuring information and confounding plans. For centuries, commanders had accepted this fog as an inevitable condition of conflict. The development of precise timekeeping offered the first real tool to pierce through it. By creating a shared, predictable schedule, a commander could impose a framework of order onto the chaos. If every unit knew what it was supposed to be doing at a specific time and trusted that other units were doing the same, the fog would lift, if only partially. This drive to manage uncertainty through scheduling led directly to the development of the modern military staff system. The medieval clerk, meticulously recording the consumption of supplies and the progress of siege works against a timeline, is the direct ancestor of the modern staff officer. Today, vast planning cells use sophisticated software to create detailed operational orders where every movement, every supply drop, every artillery barrage is scheduled down to the second. These orders are not just suggestions, they are the architectural blueprints for a battle, designed to ensure that air power, ground forces, and naval support act as a single, cohesive entity. The modern staff officer, hunched over a digital map, is performing the same essential function as the medieval engineer unrolling his parchment timetable, orchestrating a complex operation where timing is everything. This legacy extends powerfully into the realm of logistics, the unglamorous but decisive backbone of any military campaign. The medieval quartermaster who calculated how long a siege army's grain would last and scheduled supply convoys to arrive just before it ran out was pioneering the concept of just-in-time resupply. He understood that stockpiling vast quantities of material was wasteful and vulnerable, while a trickle of supplies that matched consumption was far more efficient. This principle is now a cornerstone of modern military logistics. Enormous global supply chains are managed with breathtaking precision, ensuring that fuel, ammunition, and food are delivered to forward units exactly when needed, not weeks early. The modern equivalent of the supply train winding its way to a besieging army is the complex dance of cargo ships, aircraft, and trucks, all tracked by satellite and coordinated by computers to maintain a constant flow of sustenance to the front lines. It is a system of phenomenal complexity, but its intellectual roots lie in the simple, urgent need to feed 10,000 men outside a castle wall. Viewing the medieval siege not as an archaic relic but as a vital laboratory for modern warfare completely transforms our understanding of the period. It was on those grassy fields beneath the shadow of stone walls that the essential principles of synchronized, time-sensitive warfare were tested, refined, and proven. The relentless pressure of a siege forced commanders to think in terms of schedules, logistics, and coordinated action in ways that open field battles rarely did. The technological innovation of the mechanical clock did not just change how people prayed or worked. It fundamentally reshaped military strategy, setting in motion an evolutionary path that leads directly to the digital command centers of today. The medieval world, so often dismissed as a time of darkness and disorder, was in fact the crucible where the clockwork precision of the modern world was first forged in fire and steel. When we picture a medieval battle in our minds, the image is often one of pure, unadulterated chaos, a swirling, screaming mass of knights hacking away at each other in a field, a disorganized mob charging a castle wall. This popular vision, fueled by films and fantasy, reinforces the idea of the Dark Ages as a time of brute force and technological stagnation, where military strategy was little more than a directive to hit the enemy harder. But when we zoom in on the specific, complex world of the siege, that simplistic image shatters completely. The reality uncovered by historians is one of remarkable sophistication, where success depended not on chaos, but on meticulous order and a deep understanding of time as a strategic tool. The evidence for this more nuanced view is written in the documents and dirt of history itself, detailed chronicles written by clerics and clerks who often witnessed these events firsthand go far beyond just tallying the dead. They describe the deliberate, phased construction of siege engines, the careful rotation of labor shifts, and the specific days chosen for assaults. Beyond these narratives, we have the cold, hard facts of royal payroll records. These financial documents list payments to engineers for 40 days' service, to miners for the digging of one tunnel, and to carpenters paid by the foot for timberwork. This isn't the paperwork of a chaotic enterprise. It's the bureaucracy of a carefully budgeted and scheduled military operation. Archaeologists digging at known siege sites have added another layer of proof. They don't just find arrowheads and broken swords, they uncover the geometric outlines of siege castles, laid out with surprising regularity, and the remains of workshops where standard-sized components for trebuchets and rams were mass-produced. The very layout of these temporary cities speaks to a regimented, timed daily life, with designated areas for specific tasks operating on a shared schedule. To be clear, this wasn't the digital, split-second precision of a modern military strike. A medieval commander's timetable operated on a scale of hours, not minutes or seconds. Clocks could drift, human timekeepers could make errors, and weather could disrupt the best-laid plans. Yet, the intent and the systematic approach were undeniably advanced for their time. The goal was to impose a framework of order on the inherent chaos of war, and the methods they developed, from coded trumpet calls to centralized bell ringing, were ingeniously effective within the technological limits they faced. One of the most persistent myths this evidence debunks is the idea that sieges were passive affairs, where an army simply sat outside a castle and waited for the defenders to starve. While starvation was always the ultimate goal, it was rarely the only tactic. A passive blockade was incredibly risky for the attackers, leaving them exposed to disease, harsh weather, and relief armies. Instead, a successful siege was almost always a period of intense, active, and timed military engineering. The besiegers were not just waiting, they were working against the clock. They had to construct their own protective siege castles, dig extensive lines of approach trenches to protect their soldiers, and build massive, complex engines of war, all while under the constant threat of arrows and sorties from the castle. The siege was a race between the attacker's ability to breach the walls and the defender's ability to hold out. A perfect case study that lays bare this methodical reality is the Siege of Bedford Castle in 1224. The conflict arose from a personal dispute, but King Henry III of England responded with the full, systematic force of the crown. The royal campaign was not a hurried assault, but a masterclass in step-by-step siegecraft. First, the king's forces isolated the castle, ensuring no help could arrive. Then, they systematically assembled a vast arsenal of siege engines, including trebuchets that began a relentless day and night bombardment of the walls. As the stone shot hammered the defenses, teams of miners working in shifts began their treacherous work underground, digging tunnels to undermine the castle's mighty towers. The entire operation unfolded over several weeks, each phase building on the last according to a deliberate plan. The final assault was only launched once the mining operations had successfully collapsed a key section of the defenses. The fall of Bedford wasn't a lucky break. It was the inevitable result of a meticulously timed and executed military operation. By separating these myths from the historical reality, we do more than just correct the record. We gain a profound appreciation for the intellectual achievement of medieval commanders and engineers. These were not simple-minded brutes. They were strategic thinkers, logisticians, and project managers who understood that the key to cracking the toughest fortresses lay not in uncontrolled fury, but in the disciplined, relentless, and clever application of time itself. But the relentless tick of the siege clock could not be confined to the battlefield forever. The very same technologies and disciplines that brought such formidable order to military campaigns soon began to echo through the cobblestone streets of Europe's growing towns and cities. Picture the scene in a bustling town square just a generation after a long war. The central clock tower, its design perhaps inspired by the wooden timekeeping towers of army camps, now dominates the skyline. Yet the bell that once rang to coordinate a sentry change or an artillery barrage now peals to mark the start of the market, the opening of the guild hall, or the end of the artisan's shift. This was the profound social impact of military timekeeping, the diffusion of precision from the camp to the city, a transition that would fundamentally reshape the rhythms of daily life and lay the groundwork for the modern world. Civic records from the period overflow with a palpable sense of pride in these new public clocks. Towns invested enormous sums in building magnificent clock towers, often adorning them with intricate astronomical faces and automata that drew crowds. These were not just practical tools, they were powerful symbols of a community's wealth, sophistication, and commitment to order. A town with a reliable public clock was announcing its transition from a chaotic medieval settlement to a regulated, prosperous capitalist hub. It signaled that business could be conducted fairly, that meetings could start on time, and that the community operated under a shared, predictable schedule. This was a radical departure from the agrarian rhythms that had governed life for centuries, where work was dictated by the length of the day and the needs of the season. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of this shift is a concept so familiar to us today we rarely consider its origins: being paid by the hour. This notion has its roots deeply embedded in the soil of medieval warfare. During prolonged sieges, kings and commanders did not pay their vast armies of engineers, carpenters, and mercenaries a single lump sum. Instead, they were paid based on the time they served, a certain amount per day or per week, as meticulously recorded in royal account books. This system of timed contracts was a practical solution to the immense financial burden of war, ensuring that money was spent only for services rendered. After the wars ended, these soldiers and craftsmen returned to civilian life, carrying with them the expectation that their labor had a measurable, hourly value. This mentality was eagerly adopted by the merchant guilds that controlled medieval trade and manufacturing. Guilds began to use the town clock to standardize the working day for their members, setting specific hours for apprentices to begin their work, for masters to open their shops, and for the quality of goods to be inspected. Contracts between guilds and their clients started to include clauses based on time, such as penalties for late delivery or bonuses for early completion. The clock became the impartial arbiter of commerce, reducing disputes and creating a framework of trust essential for a growing economy. A powerful illustration of this widespread adoption can be seen in the rapid proliferation of public clocks across European cities in the decades following the 100 Years' War. This prolonged period of conflict, stretching over a century, acted as a massive laboratory for military organization and time discipline. When the war finally ended, the demobilized soldiers, engineers, and administrators who had honed these skills brought them back to their hometowns. The result was a boom in clockmaking and the installation of public timepieces from London to Prague, from Ghent to Venice. The siege clock, therefore, did far more than help win battles. It introduced an entire society to the power of measured, synchronized time. It helped tick in a new, more regimented way of life, transforming how people worked, traded, and organized their communities. The relentless, predictable rhythm that once ensured a cannon was fired on schedule now ensured the market opened on time, forging a direct link between the demands of warfare and the patterns of modern economic life. Imagine the scene after a hard-fought victory. The smoke still curls from the battered walls of a conquered city, the sounds of battle replaced by an uneasy quiet. The victorious prince enters not just with soldiers but with a team of his own engineers and craftsmen, and their first act is not to plunder but to construct something new in the main square, a magnificent clock tower. As its bells ring out for the first time, marking the hours with a sound never before heard in that place, the message is unmistakable. This is no longer just a display of military might. It is the declaration of a new order. In the Middle Ages, the ability to measure and control time was not merely a practical advantage. It was one of the most profound symbols of power, prestige, and control a ruler could possess. The clock became a physical emblem of sovereignty, a declaration that the ruler's authority was now the fundamental rhythm of daily life. Art historians studying illuminated manuscripts from the period have noticed a fascinating trend. Rulers began to be depicted alongside clocks and intricate astronomical instruments. These weren't just decorative elements. They were carefully chosen symbols placing the monarch at the center of a well-ordered universe. By being shown next to a device that mastered time, the king or queen was visually associated with the divine order of creation itself. Their rule was presented as natural, inevitable, and harmonious, mirroring the perfect, predictable motions of the heavens that the clock sought to replicate. This symbolism worked on a very practical level too. A feudal lord who could impose a strict timetable on his army, ensuring sentries changed on the hour and assaults began at a precise minute, was demonstrating a fundamental skill of kingship, the ability to impose order onto chaos. This same principle then extended to the governance of his entire territory. The clock in the town square signaled that the old, irregular rhythms of agrarian life, governed by the variable sun, were being replaced by the predictable, equal hours of the sovereign's law. It meant that markets would open and close at set times, that curfews would be enforced, and that civic life would operate on a schedule dictated by the central authority. This was the essence of control, making the population governable and predictable. The most spectacular expressions of this idea were the elaborate astronomical clocks installed in royal palaces and great cathedrals. These were far more than timekeepers. They were breathtaking works of art and engineering that displayed the ruler's mastery over the entire cosmos. With their complex dials showing the positions of the sun, moon, and planets, the phases of the moon, and the signs of the zodiac, these clocks presented a miniature model of the universe itself, all ticking away under the patron's name. They proclaimed that the prince's understanding and command extended beyond the earthly realm to the very mechanics of the heavens. To own such a device was to claim a share in the divine intelligence that designed creation. A powerful example of this political theater is the clock gifted by Emperor Frederick III to the city of Prague in the 15th century. This was not a simple act of generosity. It was a calculated political statement. By bestowing this technological marvel upon the city, Frederick was embedding his imperial authority into the very fabric of its daily existence. Every time the citizens looked up at the clock face or heard its bells, they were reminded of the emperor's power, his sophistication, and his role as the bringer of order and progress. The clock became a permanent ambassador for the crown, a symbol that the emperor's rule was as constant and inescapable as the passage of time. In this way, the clock transcended its function as a mere machine. It became a potent ideological tool, a silent orator proclaiming that the ruler's will was the new metronome for society, an authority as measured, relentless, and inexorable as time itself. While the story of the European siege clock is a fascinating one, it raises a profound question. Was this reliance on measured time a universal phenomenon, or a uniquely Western development? To find the answer, we must cast our gaze eastward to the brilliant technological centers of Song Dynasty China and the Islamic world, where the science of timekeeping was, in many ways, even more advanced. In the 11th century, while European monks were building their first weight-driven clocks, a Chinese polymath named Su Song constructed a true marvel, an enormous astronomical clock tower over 30 feet high. Powered by a sophisticated water wheel mechanism, this device not only told the time but also tracked the movements of stars and planets, a feat of engineering that would not be matched in Europe for centuries. The existence of such an instrument proves that the conceptual leap to mechanical timekeeping was not Europe's alone. The great historian Joseph Needham, in his monumental work on Chinese science, documented this and countless other inventions, revealing a civilization with a deep and sophisticated understanding of mathematics, engineering, and astronomy, all the ingredients necessary for precise military coordination. Islamic scholars and engineers similarly perfected the astrolabe and developed intricate water clocks, using them to regulate the 5 daily prayers with a precision that mirrored European monastic life. So if the technology was there, and in some cases superior, why didn't we see the same kind of clockwork siege emerge in the East? The answer lies not in a lack of capability, but in a difference of context. The way a society fights a war is shaped by its political structure, its military traditions, and its very definition of what war is for. In Europe, the feudal system created a very specific kind of military challenge. An army was often a temporary coalition of diverse forces, a king's own knights, barons with their personal retinues, and companies of mercenaries from different regions, all with their own commanders and loyalties. Coordinating these disparate groups for a prolonged siege required a neutral, objective standard that everyone could agree on: the clock. It was a tool for managing complexity and enforcing discipline across a potentially fractious alliance. The prolonged, methodical siege was also a central feature of European warfare, driven by the goal of capturing specific, heavily fortified castles that were the seats of noble power. In contrast, consider the military machine of the Mongol Empire. Their approach to siege warfare was not built on patience and precision, but on overwhelming speed and psychological terror. When the Mongols laid siege to a city, their goal was not a methodical strangulation over months, but a rapid, shocking collapse. They famously employed tactics of utter ruthlessness, often massacring populations of cities that resisted to instill fear in the next target. Their engineering was brilliant and adaptive. They transported Chinese siege engineers across Asia to build trebuchets on site, but the tempo of their campaigns was blistering. They sought to overwhelm defenders before they could properly organize a defense, making the prolonged, scheduled bombardment of European warfare counterproductive to their strategy. The clock was less useful when the objective was to strike like lightning. This is not to say that Eastern armies ignored timekeeping. They used it extensively, but often for different yet equally vital purposes. Chinese military manuals detail the use of water clocks and incense clocks, which burned at a predictable rate to meticulously time the watches of the night. Ensuring sentries were changed on schedule to prevent fatigue and maintain vigilance was as important in Beijing as it was in Paris. The difference was in the application to grand tactics. The Chinese Imperial Army, a vast, centralized and professional force, may have relied more on hierarchical command and standardized drills than on the shared, independent timekeeping needed to coordinate a feudal coalition. The sophisticated timekeeping of the Islamic world was deeply woven into the fabric of daily life and worship, and while it certainly regulated military camp life, the strategic imperatives of their conflicts might not have demanded the same level of inter-unit synchronization for complex assaults. The story, therefore, is not one of superiority or inferiority, but of divergent paths. The European Clockwork siege was a brilliant adaptation to a specific set of political and military conditions: feudal fragmentation and the dominance of the stone castle. It was one solution to the problem of organized violence. The Eastern traditions, with their own profound technological achievements, developed different solutions tailored to their own realities. The centralized bureaucracy of China, the cavalry empires of the steppes, and the vast caliphates of the Islamic world. This global perspective enriches our understanding, showing that the history of technology is never a simple straight line, but a branching tree, with each culture grafting innovation onto the unique rootstock of its own experience. The theories and chronicles we've explored paint a compelling picture, but how can we be sure that this intricate clockwork of siege warfare was real? The answer doesn't just lie in dusty manuscripts. It's being unearthed piece by piece from the very soil where these armies camped. Picture an archaeologist kneeling in a trench on the outskirts of a historic castle, their trowel carefully brushing away centuries of dirt to reveal not a sword or a skeleton, but a small, corroded brass gear wheel. This seemingly insignificant fragment, found amidst the remains of a besieger's camp, is a direct link to the past, a tangible piece of the temporal machinery that orchestrated these grand military operations. This is the archaeology of time, a field dedicated to recovering the material evidence of how people structured and experienced their days. For the medieval period, this evidence is often subtle, but when pieced together, it reveals a world far more organized than we might imagine. The material culture of military timekeeping includes a range of objects, from the humble to the complex. Excavations have yielded fragments of portable sundials, small enough for a commander to carry in his purse, their gnomons designed to be aligned for a rough reading of the solar hour. In colder climates, the remains of candle clocks have been identified, candles marked with rings to indicate the passage of time as they burned down through the night. While delicate organic materials like wood and rope rarely survive, the discovery of metal fittings and stone foundation pits on siege sites strongly suggests the presence of temporary bell towers, central points from which the camp's daily schedule would have been regulated. Beyond these specific timekeeping devices, the layout of the siege camp itself is a powerful testament to a regimented existence. Archaeologists don't just find a random scatter of debris, they uncover a deliberate urban plan imposed upon the landscape. The positions of latrine pits, for instance, are consistently placed downwind and at a regulated distance from sleeping and cooking areas, reflecting strict sanitary codes that could only be enforced through a shared routine. The discovery of distinct workshop zones is particularly telling. In one area, you might find concentrations of wood shavings and specialized carpentry tools. In another, a scatter of metal slag and the remains of a forge. This separation of trades indicates an organized system of production where teams of specialists worked in designated areas, likely on shifts, to produce the components of siege engines. The analysis of siege works offers another layer of temporal evidence. By studying the construction of a siege castle or an approach trench, archaeologists can determine the phases of its building. They can see where a ditch was dug first, where a rampart was thrown up behind it, and where later reinforcements were added. This sequence of construction implies a schedule, a logical order of operations that would have required careful planning and timed labor to execute efficiently under the threat of attack. A compelling example comes from the site of the Siege of Dover Castle in 1216. Excavations revealed a concentrated area just beyond effective arrow range from the castle walls, littered with woodworking debris and standardized metal fittings. This has been interpreted as a dedicated craftsman's camp, a production line where siege towers and battering rams were prefabricated in sections before being moved into position. The organization of this space suggests a highly coordinated effort, with different teams responsible for different tasks, all working to a timetable that ensured the engines were ready for the assault when the commander gave the signal. These physical clues, from a broken gear to the ghostly outline of a workshop, are what transform historical theory into tangible reality. They provide silent, yet undeniable, proof that the daily rhythm of a siege was not a chaotic scramble, but a carefully managed operation, its pulse measured by the technology of the hour. Carved into the stone of a medieval cathedral or painted in the margin of a prayer book, you might find a haunting image, a crowned skull resting next to an hourglass, its sand steadily draining away. This is a memento mori, a reminder of death, but it is also a profound statement about time. For the medieval mind, the hourglass wasn't just a tool for measuring a sermon's length or a sailor's watch. It was a stark symbol of life's fleeting nature and the ultimate deadline that awaited every soul. This deeply philosophical and theological understanding of time permeated every aspect of life, and warfare was no exception. It transformed the practical measurement of hours into a matter of cosmic significance, infusing military campaigns with an urgency that was as much about salvation as it was about victory. The ancient world often viewed time as cyclical, an endless loop of seasons and ages, but the Christian worldview, shaped by theologians like St. Augustine, introduced a radical new concept: time as linear and finite. In his great work, The City of God, Augustine wrestled with the nature of time, arguing that it was a created thing, a temporary state that began with Genesis and would culminate in a final, divine judgment. Time, therefore, had a direction and a purpose. It was a one-way journey from creation to apocalypse, and every human life was a segment of that grand, unfolding narrative. This belief meant that time was not a neutral resource to be spent, but a sacred, God-given opportunity to secure one's eternal fate. Every hour was a gift, and every day brought the world closer to its conclusion. This mindset fundamentally altered how a medieval commander viewed a siege. A prolonged military campaign was more than a logistical challenge. It was a spiritual test played out on a temporal stage. The success or failure of a siege was often interpreted as a sign of divine favor or displeasure. If an army prospered and a castle fell quickly, it was seen as God willing the outcome, a validation of the cause's righteousness. Conversely, if a siege dragged on for months, plagued by disease, mutiny, or failed assaults, it could be interpreted as a punishment for sin or a test of faith for the devout. The relentless ticking of the camp clock, therefore, measured not just the consumption of supplies, but the patience and piety of the entire army. Were they worthy of God's assistance? Would their faith hold fast under the strain of a long and bloody ordeal? Time became the medium through which this divine drama was expressed, forcing commanders and soldiers alike to see their earthly struggle as part of a much larger celestial battle. This intersection of sacred and profane time manifested in very practical ways on the battlefield. One of the most striking examples was the widespread practice of declaring truces on religious holidays. Even in the midst of a bitter siege, combat might cease for Christmas or Easter, allowing both attackers and defenders to participate in Mass and observe the holy day. This was not merely a chivalric courtesy. It was a profound acknowledgement that the rhythms of human conflict were subordinate to the sacred calendar of God. It inserted moments of eternal, sacred time into the temporal, worldly time of war, reminding everyone that their ultimate allegiance was to a higher power. This practice created bizarre but telling scenes of fraternization, where men who would try to kill each other the next day might exchange greetings or share food, all under the temporary peace of a shared faith. Nowhere was this fusion of time, faith, and warfare more explicit than in the preaching of the Crusades. The call to liberate Jerusalem was framed as a race against time on an apocalyptic scale. Preachers argued that the Holy Land had been in the hands of infidels for too long, and that its redemption was a necessary step in the divine plan. Delays were not just strategic setbacks, they were spiritual failures that risked God's wrath. The crusade itself was presented as a pilgrimage, a journey through both space and time towards salvation. For the individual knight, participating was a way to atone for a lifetime of sin in a concentrated, heroic effort. His time on earth was being invested in a venture that promised eternal rewards. The success of the entire endeavor was often linked to prophecies and timelines, creating an immense psychological pressure to act quickly and decisively. This deeper worldview forces us to see the medieval clock in a completely different light. It was more than a machine for coordination. It was a metaphysical instrument. Its steady tick echoed the heartbeat of a universe moving purposefully toward a final reckoning. When a commander used a clock to schedule an assault, he was not just organizing his men, he was aligning his actions, however imperfectly, with what he believed was the divine schedule for history itself. The clock measured the hours, but it also measured the unfolding of a divine plan, a constant reminder that in the midst of siege and storm, every moment was charged with eternal significance. But the relentless march of innovation never ceases. The great clock towers that brought order to towns and siege camps were magnificent, but they were also stationary, tethered to their stone foundations. The next revolutionary leap would come from an invention that truly set time free: the spring-driven mechanism. Emerging in the 15th century, this was the breakthrough that would shrink the entire concept of the clock from a monumental public fixture to a personal, portable possession. Imagine the challenge faced by early horologists. A weight-driven clock relies on gravity, a constant, predictable force, but it demands a large, vertical space for the weights to drop. To create something portable, they needed a new power source, one that could be wound up and carried around. The solution was the mainspring, a carefully coiled ribbon of metal that slowly uncoiled to release stored energy. This was the key that unlocked miniaturization, but it introduced a fiendish new problem of its own: isochronism. A mainspring does not deliver constant force. It is strongest when fully wound and weakens as it unwinds. This variation would cause a clock to run fast at first and then slow down dramatically, making it hopelessly inaccurate. The genius of the solution, the fusee, was a masterpiece of mechanical elegance. It was a cone-shaped pulley linked to the mainspring by a fine chain. As the spring weakened, the chain would pull on a narrower part of the cone, effectively increasing its mechanical leverage and compensating for the loss of power. This delicate dance between spring and fusee was what made the portable timepiece a reality. This technological leap triggered a profound social and military shift: the personalization of time. No longer was precise timekeeping a communal experience, dictated by the bells echoing from a central tower. Now, an individual, particularly a military officer, could carry a miniature clock in their pocket or wear it on their person. This was a transformation in command and control as significant as the invention of the radio centuries later. A field commander no longer had to rely on seeing a distant signal flag or hearing a trumpet call that might be lost in the wind. He could simply glance at his own watch. This allowed for unprecedented tactical flexibility. Subordinate officers leading detached units, a cavalry screen miles ahead of the main army, or a flanking column moving through difficult terrain, could now coordinate their movements with the central command based on a shared, precise timetable. They could execute complex maneuvers requiring split-second timing across a dispersed battlefield, trusting that their personal timepiece was synchronized with the general's. This new capability found one of its most critical applications on the rolling decks of warships during the Age of Sail. The greatest navigational challenge of the era was determining longitude, a ship's east-west position on the featureless ocean. Latitude could be found from the sun and stars, but longitude required knowing the precise difference between local time aboard the ship and the time at a fixed reference point, like the Royal Observatory in Greenwich. Each hour of difference equated to 15 degrees of longitude. A mistake of just a few minutes could mean missing a landfall by dozens of miles, leading to shipwreck and disaster. The quest for a marine chronometer that could keep accurate time despite the pitching waves, salt spray, and temperature changes of a long voyage became a national priority, famously solved by John Harrison. The pocket watch, in its most robust and precise form, thus became the key to global empire, a direct descendant of the medieval need to synchronize actions for survival. We can see the full flowering of this portable time revolution on the battlefields of the Napoleonic Wars. Officers on both sides carried pocket watches, and entire battle plans were drafted with precise timetables. The complexity of maneuvers involving multiple army corps, each tens of thousands strong, demanded this new level of coordination. A marshal like Napoleon's Mitchell Ney could order an artillery battery to commence fire at a specific minute to soften enemy lines, precisely as an infantry division began its advance from another sector, while cavalry waited in reserve, their charge time to exploit the exact moment of breakthrough. The entire battle became a symphony conducted by the watch, its success depending on the harmonious timing of each individual part. The medieval siege, with its camp-wide bells and scheduled assaults, was the essential crucible that first proved the immense military value of measuring time with precision. That proof set in motion an unstoppable innovation race, a drive for ever smaller, ever more accurate personal timepieces that would eventually lead from the officer's pocket watch to the soldier's wristwatch in the trenches of World War I, and finally to the satellite synchronized digital clocks that guide modern drone strikes and cyber operations. The journey from the town square clock to the pocket watch was more than just a story of miniaturization. It was the moment time truly became a weapon you could carry in your hand. To truly appreciate the profound shift we've been exploring, it helps to step back and trace the arc of this transformation, to see the key moments where timekeeping and warfare became increasingly intertwined. Let's imagine a timeline not as a dry list of dates, but as a story of escalating sophistication, where each innovation built upon the last, tightening the bond between the clock and the conquest. Our story begins not with intricate gears, but with a single, powerful sound echoing across a landscape, the ringing of a church bell. In the early Middle Ages, long before mechanical clocks, these bells were the primary tool for communal timekeeping. Their sound carried for miles, and their purpose was deeply spiritual, calling the faithful to prayer at the canonical hours. But their application was immediately practical for military life. The same bell that called monks to vespers could be rung with a different, more urgent peal to warn of an approaching army, to summon the local levy to the castle walls, or to signal a curfew. This was the most basic form of military timekeeping, a simple, powerful auditory signal that coordinated a community's defense. It established the fundamental principle that a shared understanding of a moment could be the difference between safety and disaster. The next great leap forward arrived in the 14th century, a true turning point that reshaped the very fabric of society. The widespread adoption of the weight-driven mechanical clock in European towns and monasteries. This was the technological Big Bang for our story. For the first time, the equal hour became a practical reality, independent of the seasons or the weather. This wasn't just an improvement on the sundial, it was a conceptual revolution. The clock moved time from a natural phenomenon to a measurable, manageable resource. In a military context, this meant a commander could now plan not just for dawn or dusk, but for a specific, repeatable hour. He could issue orders for an assault to begin at the 4th hour after midnight and have reasonable confidence that every captain in his army understood exactly when that was. This shared precision allowed for the coordination of complex maneuvers across a sprawling siege camp, turning a collection of individual units into a single, synchronized instrument of war. We can see this new potential put to the test in the grueling siege of Calais, which began in 1346. King Edward III of England's campaign to capture this vital French port was a masterpiece of logistical patience. It involved not only a land army but also a naval blockade that had to be maintained for over a year. The success of such a prolonged operation hinged on impeccable camp discipline, rotating sentries, managing supply convoys, and organizing the relentless work of building siege engines and digging trenches. While we don't have records of a giant clock tower erected by Edward's army, the sheer scale and duration of the siege and its ultimate success strongly imply a level of temporal organization that would have been incredibly difficult without the conceptual framework of measured, equal hours that mechanical clocks were then popularizing. This logistical precision, perfected in conflicts like the 100 Years' War, then paved the way for a more dynamic and aggressive application of time in the 15th century, particularly during the Wars of the Roses. This bloody civil war for the English throne was characterized not by long, static sieges, but by rapid, decisive campaigns where armies marched across the country to engage each other in pitched battles. In this environment, speed and synchronization became paramount. A commander's ability to move his forces faster than his rival, to concentrate them at a strategic crossroads before the enemy arrived, or to coordinate the movements of separate columns converging on a single battlefield. These were the keys to victory. This required a more fluid and personal command of time. The timing of a forced march, the coordination of a rendezvous, the launch of an ambush all relied on an ingrained discipline and a shared temporal sense that had been cultivated over the preceding centuries. The trend this timeline reveals is unmistakable, a steady march towards the deeper integration of precise time as a decisive factor in military success. What began with the simple, urgent sound of a warning bell evolved into the complex, scheduled ballet of a full-scale siege, and then into the rapid, timed maneuvers of field armies. This was not a gradual improvement but an accelerating revolution, each milestone built upon the last, demonstrating the ever-growing value of temporal control. And this trend did not end with the Middle Ages, it exploded. The lessons learned in these medieval conflicts, that time could be measured, managed, and weaponized, became the foundation for the military science of the Renaissance and the modern era, setting the stage for a world where every soldier would eventually carry the power of the clock in their pocket. The ticking of the medieval clock was more than a sound. It was the heartbeat of a new kind of warfare. It represented a fundamental shift from chaos to coordination, from brute force to a sophisticated ballet of logistics and psychological pressure. We have journeyed together from the first mechanical clocks in monastery towers to the sprawling, time-regulated siege camps, witnessing how the simple act of measuring an hour transformed the art of war. This was not a minor adjustment, it was a revolution in thought. Commanders learned that synchronizing the movement of thousands of soldiers, the firing of cannon, and the delivery of supplies could achieve what sheer numbers alone often could not. They weaponized predictability to exhaust their enemies and used the torment of the unknown to shatter morale, turning the very passage of time into a siege engine as powerful as any trebuchet. This legacy, born amidst the smoke and thunder of besieged castles, extends far beyond those ancient stone walls. It fundamentally shaped the modern world's obsession with schedules, efficiency, and precision. The regimented day that governed a siege camp, with its shifts for laborers, its timed meals, and its synchronized assaults, became the blueprint for the industrial factory floor centuries later. The concept of paying a worker for their time, a practice refined in the accounting tents of medieval armies, evolved into the hourly wage that structures our economic lives today. The relentless pursuit of just-in-time logistics to feed a besieging army finds its direct descendant in the global supply chains that deliver goods to our doors with breathtaking speed. Our entire contemporary existence, governed by calendars, deadlines, and digital reminders, operates on principles that were first tested and proven under the extreme pressures of medieval warfare. So the next time you instinctively glance at your watch or check the time on your phone, take a moment to consider the incredible history behind that simple action. You are not just seeing numbers, you are witnessing the echo of a military revolution. You are using a technology that was once a decisive weapon, a tool that allowed commanders to orchestrate destruction with a previously unimaginable level of control. The relentless, measurable tick that now paces our commutes and our meetings once decided the fate of kingdoms. If this journey through the hidden clockwork of siege warfare has opened your eyes to a more sophisticated and fascinating medieval world, we would be thrilled to continue exploring with you. Help us uncover more of these forgotten histories by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And we are genuinely curious to hear your thoughts. What other medieval technologies or innovations do you believe secretly shaped the world we live in today? Share your ideas in the comments below, and let's keep the conversation ticking.